The Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a licensed psychotherapist here in Toronto, Canada. And the title of this episode is Beyond the Fight, Navigating Conflict. Now, primarily I'm going to focus a lot on couple conflict, but the principles apply to really any relationship. So, first of all, I think conflict gets a bad rap sometimes because people tend to feel that conflict's, a negative thing, that relationships that have frequent conflict are not good relationships. And so I think we want to understand and really delve into this because conflict in itself is not the problem. Preparing and moving through conflict or, discussions or arguments or whatever we want to call it in a healthy way is ideal. And if you've talked to couples, even just chat with a couple that have been together for 20, 30 years, what you'll quickly notice is they will often refer to those challenging periods in their life as ones that strengthen the relationship. And so that's what typically I find. Couples that start to develop healthier ways of moving through conflict will actually feel they have a stronger relationship and feel a lot more confident. So this brings me to the first thing I wanted to address. So why is conflict a natural and necessary part of relationships? Well, if you think about it, it makes sense. You have two people that are very different, the different goals, different values, in some cases, different needs. And so they're living together, or they are together in a relationship, and they're trying to navigate life with these differences. And so invariably, if you look at it that way, it makes sense that they will occasionally have moments of disconnection, conflict, disagreement, etc. The way we also look at conflict in relationships or in terms of relationships is that the more emotionally connected someone is, invariably, the greater the chances that they may hurt or upset you, because it makes sense, you're closer, you're more aware of the other. Couples that, for example, are quite distant from each other don't respond that much to if one person comes home late or doesn't respond to a message or may have not sort of met your need in a certain moment because you're kind of used to that happening. People that are very close and connected, very vulnerable with each other, that's a key part of it, are quite exposed, and they'll naturally have these uncomfortable experiences. Now, those can easily be worked through, easily be, a couple of sentences, and they've, fixed it, repaired it, and they move on. So it's not really like you would think of in terms of most people think, oh gosh, they have a fight, and then they don't speak for the rest of the day. And for healthier couples that have good skills in this area, that is not at all what happens. So really the thing is, I also want to look at is unhealthy conflict. Unhealthy conflict is a little more obvious to people. It's people that want to avoid, people that want to attack or, attack the other person in terms of name calling, things like this. These things are pretty obvious. But I would think the average couple is not necessarily calling each other names, but they're maybe just getting frustrated, moving away from each other and not spending time later repairing it. Typically, I find that as a couples therapist, people just kind of move through conflict, get upset, get defensive, stop talking. Then, they have to talk about the house or what's for dinner or something like that. So then they start communicating around basic household or lifestyle stuff. And that's how they sort of then start communicating again. But they haven't resolved or worked through the issue. In some cases they try to, and if it blows up again, they likely will not keep doing that. So healthy conflict, a key part of it is hearing the other person, of course, but also validating their other person's perspective. This is such a challenging thing for people because if I believe one thing and I have a perspective and you have a different one, I think it's hard for people to say, I totally get how you could come to that perspective, because I think in the moment they feel that somehow I'm going to lose this discussion, or I'm going to lose my position, that we'll have to adopt and choose your perspective over mine. It's not that way at all. I think what you're telling each other is, hey, I can see how you got to this perspective, but I have a different one. And I think when you can do that, there's like a healthy respect between people. They're listening to each other, they're feeling heard and understood, and also cared for in a sense, because like you're not, the defensive parts of us that get triggered are kind of like, why do you keep bringing this up? I can't, like, why is that important to you? That's not, and then we sort of debate them, like that's not the right way to look at something. Obviously that doesn't feel very good versus something like, hey, I totally get how you could get there. I can see that myself. That makes sense to me. But I'm looking at it this way. It's just the average person, let's face it, unless they've done couples therapy or done a course or read a book, doesn't have a lot of like conscious skills around how to navigate conflict. They kind of are just bouncing through in the moment. So what are some of the common causes of couple conflict? I mean, basic ones: unmet needs, miscommunication, people being emotionally triggered are pretty common. One of the problems with unmet needs is it's often not expressed. Now, sometimes people are not aware of those unmet needs. Other times they are afraid to express them for fear they'll be rejected. So in some cases, people much prefer to not share, not be vulnerable, than to share something like, I would like to be closer to you, and have the other person say, you know what, I'm fine with the level of closeness we have, it works for me. Now, typically someone wouldn't say that, but I think our fears around these areas, circulate around that, about the, being vulnerable, expressing a need, and then having it rejected or denied, or someone saying something like, I can't, why is that important? So a lot of the conflict, I think we call it sometimes in couples therapy a protest for connection. It's really those unmet needs surfacing, but it's not coming through in a way that's helpful. It's coming through like, why didn't you put your coat away, or why did you leave the socks on the floor, or how come you didn't mow the lawn? Maybe instead of what actually they're saying is, why haven't we, been intimate for a while? Why haven't you hugged me for a while? Why haven't you, planned a date night? Something like that. So those are the things typically in couples therapy we sort of delve into. So in terms of conflict resolution strategies, as I was just saying, like active listening with the intent to understand rather than just like letting the other person finish speaking, is really important. It's a great skill. And learning how to validate emotions. So what I tell couples is, I tell clients is, when somebody's sharing with you, try to look for a bit, like look for the story. They're telling you like, this is why this upset me. And look for the emotion, like it really hurt me when that happened. So then when you reflect back and you share a bit of the story, then you say, I know that hurt you. I hear that hurt you. That you'll notice it much more powerful for the other person, because they'll really feel, if you are able to share the emotion, they'll feel, yeah, you really get what I'm saying, because that is the most important part of what they're saying. The other thing is to stay, and this takes a bit of self-regulation, at least it takes some skills actually, the importance of staying curious, not defensive. So many people, in fact, most of the work I do is around helping couples be aware of when they become defensive, because once you become defensive, it's like this wall goes up, and it's just not working. But the opposite of being defensive is staying curious. I'd really like to understand how you got to that decision. I really would like to know more about why you feel this way or why you feel that way, versus like, well, that's not important, or that's not a thing, or, well, I don't think that way. So usually if people are able to take a couple of deep breaths, slow down, it really helps them be aware of these defensive patterns. The other thing, as we were mentioning earlier, like understanding the underlying emotions behind the arguments, unmet needs, as I mentioned, but also things like I'm scared or I'm sad. Anger being a secondary emotion, a lot of times what we see is the sadness, the fear, the shame, the hurt comes across as anger. So the people will often share, I'm so frustrated with my partner, which is a beginning for us, but we want to go deeper than that. What's below the frustration? Most people will say, like, I'm sad. This relationship is starting to feel a bit hopeless for me. I don't know how to fix it. Or I'm scared we're not going to stay together. Or I'm just really hurt because all of these things that have happened. And so then the anger, which we call, of course, our protector, often comes over those softer emotions and really makes it hard for people to understand what actually is going on. Once they do, then they're able to share, I'm a bit scared when this happens, or I'm feeling a bit hopeless about and sad about our relationship. I don't know where it's going, etc. The other thing that's really helpful, and this is not something people intuitively do usually, is use I statements. I feel, I think, this is my perspective, these are my thoughts, this is where I'm coming from, this is how I see it, etc. All kind of frames it in a way that this is just a perspective you have rather than absolute truth. People that get in trouble will say things like, you're always late. And the person's like, no, I'm not. And then they start arguing instead of, it feels to me sometimes like you've been late more frequently than you used to be. Or it seems to me that you struggle with being on time. You'll find that certainly it sounds like a simple change makes a huge difference because the other person is not hearing something as a statement of truth, which they normally would then disagree with. Because, of course, one of the other things people do is they say never, always. And those don't work because even if a person has one example of where they did something, they'll say that's not true. What the person is really saying is generally, this seems to be happening more than I'm comfortable with. I want to talk about it. If you say you're always late, you never listen, etc., it's just gets defensive and just spirals. So the other thing, too, is just to be aware of, this is so helpful, our nervous system has everything to do with how we interact, how our discussions go. If we're slipping into fight or flight, our whole physiology changes. Everything is different. And it makes it very hard to have a calm, rational, caring kind of conversation with a person that you love. They often become sort of an adversary, and the defensive parts kick in, and it escalates, and it's really very hard to even tap into those deeper feelings around the person and the relationship, because you're just seeing this hurt, you're just seeing something that upset you, they said or did, or the way they're talking to you, and you're just escalating. So being able to take a time out, take a break, say, let's talk about this in a couple of hours. Usually I like people to say, could we take a break? I don't find it helpful if you tell the other person, we need to stop, you need to stop, you're getting too upset. That won't work because they're already in this defensive place. You're going to be kind of control them. That's not going to work. So say, look, hey, is it possible for us to talk about this in a couple of hours? I'm really upset. I think we're both a bit escalated. I think this would be helpful. And then generally, as long as you're going to maintain and prioritize that talking again part, then I think you'll be okay. It's when people say, let's talk in a couple hours, and they just don't do it, that there's, the person no longer trusts you when you say that. So now another framework for conflict resolution that I find quite helpful, it's a simple sort of way of looking at it, actually comes from nonviolent communication, which was developed in the 60s for work in schools. And it's a very simple structure that's easy to remember. So when you're sharing your perspective, The goal is to share observations, feelings, needs, and then requests. So this would be an example. So I had noticed that you didn't respond to the texts I sent this morning. And the feeling could be, I don't feel valued when you don't respond to me. And then the need could be, it's important for me in a relationship that we would have timely communication. And then a request could be along those lines. In future, if you can't respond to my message, could you just let me know when you will? And if you can you be more prompt, let's say, in doing that? And so that's where both people kind of share. And it's a very detailed approach, but that's just kind of it in an overview. I find it very helpful for the other person to understand, like, what are your needs? What are you seeing happening? Is this, and the requests are helpful in terms of, like, what could you do? What could we make sure, like, how could we, not have this keep happening, basically? So attachment styles I want to touch on briefly, because this comes up a lot these days. A lot of people are very familiar with their attachment style. The model I use, emotionally focused therapy with couples, is focused a lot on attachment. Now, many years ago, 20 years ago or so, very few people knew about attachment styles. But now, unfortunately, so many people are Googling and hearing these things on social media that everybody sort of starts to feel that they're perhaps anxious or avoidant, like it's a sort of fixed way of being that doesn't change. So the reality is that people will have, in most cases, a style, a sort of, they're a bit anxious, a bit avoidant. Most people, 60-70% of the population, are what we would call securely attached to their parents. We're securely attached to their parents. So they tend to navigate, challenges in relationships much easier. So the thing to remember is that, like, if you're in a relationship with a very secure person and you, say, have an anxious attachment generally, but the other person is quite validating, quite present, doesn't sort of disappear or withdraw, you will probably not feel that anxious in the relationship. It might come up now and again. But if you're in a relationship with someone who's avoidant and you try to move towards them and then they get overwhelmed and they move away, obviously you're going to notice to a greater degree this part of you. I don't like people sort of labeling themselves as one style, and is in a sense that it's fixed and never changes. I don't think that's accurate. Not to mention the fact that, one of the things we do in couples therapy is help couples have a secure bond, a secure relationship, a secure attachment with each other. So no matter where you came from, you can change that. The thing to remember about them is, and they're pretty obvious based on the title, is that a secure person will be have a lot more ability to regulate themselves and cope with distress in the relationship. An anxious person will tend to move towards the person when they're in distress. An avoidant person will tend to move away. And unfortunately, a lot of relationships involve anxious and avoidant people. We lump those and call them insecure attachment styles. And unfortunately, they're kind of in opposite patterns, but they seem to end up in relationships together. So those would be the most challenging. So that's just a quick overview of attachment styles. Certainly there's lots on information on the internet to learn more about that. So one of the ways, how is it that we create safety and security in conflict? Well, one of them is by staying present. The other thing is to stay regulated, stay calm, and certainly not to use threats or ultimatums. Now, those are tactics people use because they do get a desired behavior change, but they're not healthy and they'll lead to a sense of not feeling safe. They'll trigger often a lot of anxiety and a sense of not being secure, and that's not the best way to approach anything. Really, the core of that would be, I'm really struggling with this behavior, I need it to change, but saying, if you don't change it, I'm gone, is not ideal. So So the one of the key, this is a key part of this this discussion is this episode is the role of emotional regulation. So the key to really, as I mentioned earlier about the nervous system and fight or flight, if we can stay grounded and stay fairly calm in the relationship and stay self-regulated, we will be able to navigate conflict quite well. We'll be able to see this person that's talking to us as a person we love and care for, we have a relationship with, and we have so much of many years together, or, we have a family of kids, whatever it may be. We are in an important relationship together. So that's really helpful. When you start to get really elevated, you tend to look at the person as an adversary, or a person that's, getting in the way of you doing something you want, or a person that's hurting you, and your whole way of approaching them changes. So being able to stay calm is really a great skill. And there are lots of different ways to do that. I mentioned earlier timeouts. Taking a break is great. Mindfulness, breathing techniques. I'm very fond of 4-7-8 breathing. So if you're going to take a break from a conversation, give yourself a moment to just kind of calm down a little. Breathing in 4-7-8. So breathe in for 4, hold for 7, and then exhale for 8. But when you exhale, try to exhale in a stronger exhale that will trigger your parasympathetic nervous system and help calm you down. As I said earlier about timeouts, they're really indispensable. We have to really get good at knowing when we're upset, noticing when the conversation is going the wrong direction, and don't allow it to get too elevated before you do that, because it makes it very hard for both people to agree to stop. One might want to stop, the other refuses to. Well, the other thing too is if we can stay calm and present, and our partner struggles with that, us being calm and present will help them regulate. If we both escalate, it makes it obviously quite challenging. We both feed off of each other, of course. So the other thing I wanted to talk quickly about is the Gottmans are a couple of psychologists, or a married couple. They've done a lot of research on couples over the years. A lot of the information we have comes from them. I'm tremendously grateful for all that they've contributed to couple work. But they have a little and I guess it's an acronym, or whatever you call it. It's they call it the 4 Horsemen, which refers to the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse from the Bible, which is obviously not a good thing. And the reason they highlight this is there's 4 things in their research they noticed that when couples do this frequently, it predicts divorce to something like 90%. And those are pretty straightforward in some respects. But it's just really important couples realize how unhealthy these ways of engaging with the other person are. So one is criticism. We watch our tone, watch how we phrase things. Criticizing our partner, although it's coming from a place of frustration sometimes, is not helpful. Contempt is terrible. Talking down to your partner, rolling your eyes, making them feel like they're somehow beneath you or less than. Defensiveness is very common, although if it's always present, it's really challenging. So basically, if every time I speak to my partner, they get defensive, it can make speaking to them almost pointless. And the last one is very destructive. And I want to talk a bit about the last one because some people get confused about it. So stonewalling is not to be confused with being emotionally overwhelmed or emotionally flooded. Those are more, some people shut down and they can't really control it. But I look at stonewalling as more of like an active choice to not speak. So for example, I could have an argument with my partner, and then they try to speak to me a few hours later about something, and I remain silent, refuse to speak. And they keep asking me something, and I just refuse to speak. So that is more of like an intent to to not respond, to punish the person. That's very different from someone who gets overwhelmed and shuts down for 15 minutes, because that person can then say, sorry, I'm overwhelmed, I just need a moment, something like that. Willfully, ignoring the person or avoiding the person. Generally, the goal is to punish them this way. Like, obviously it makes sense. The person's trying to talk to you. If you don't respond, they'll get upset. So you're punishing them for maybe the conflict you had or something they said, etc. That is very unhealthy. And you need to, if you're doing these, then please see a therapist or somebody to help you learn other ways of navigating conflict, because it's very destructive. So the key part about conflict here is repairing. I mentioned that in the beginning. So what is the importance of repair and reconnection? Well, it's everything really to conflict resolution. Like, conflict that's repaired is no longer an issue. Conflict that is just, buried in stuff is a problem. And couples that repair, as I said in the beginning of the podcast, will have a strong sense that their relationship is healthy. They will feel good in the relationship. They will both feel confident that if they encounter a challenging day or argument, that they can get through it because they know how to repair. And the more they do repair, the more confident they become. So one of the things that's really important sometimes, and this is very individual to the people, so you want to ask your partner about this. If people have very specific needs when it comes to apologies. Some people need the person to say sorry. Some people need to see actionable steps. Some people need them to just listen, to talk about how much it hurt when this happened to them. So it's important that you have a sense of that. So I've had some people that are trying to work through things that have really done heartfelt, empathetic apologies and not actually said the words, I'm sorry. And to the person, it's like, well, you didn't say sorry. So make sure you're aware of that, because we want to make sure that we're meeting our partner's needs when we're doing this. Generally, I like people to acknowledge with a sorry, but then to, sometimes share the active steps you're going to take to make sure it doesn't happen again, or just make sure those steps happen. Because if you keep having things happen and you keep just saying, oh, sorry, it doesn't take long for the person is like, stop saying sorry. You keep doing the same thing and, figure out another way to approach this. The other thing that we find is quite helpful is what we call creating rituals of connection after an argument. So having a meal together, some couples would have sex afterwards. Sharing some stories, sometimes when you first met, I find is helpful. Sometimes during these conflicted times, it's very hard for people to tap into the loving, positive feelings they have for the person. They tend to be very much focused on all the things they've done to hurt them or things they've said, and the mind is very focused on that. It can be very negative. So I think these rituals are very helpful to kind of just reconnect the couple. And they have to, of course, talk through things first. Just reconnect the couple and help them feel that we're on a positive setting. So the other thing is that, of course, a lot of this I'm saying is very general. There are couples that are fighting in terms of, like, it's very, very serious. It could be physical or verbal, emotional abuse happening. This makes it much more challenging. I would say as a couples therapist, generally couples therapy is not recommended if there's physical violence, because it's just not safe. We could have a session and somebody could say the wrong thing or something, and then we just wouldn't feel typically that the person, or either person would be safe going home afterwards or after the session. So it would generally want that person to get individual help first until they have a lot more coping or self-regulation skills, just to make it safer. So in terms of, like, if you're trying these different things, it's just not working. If there's been some serious hurt that you can't seem to get past, if there's been some trust broken, betrayal, something like that, if possible, I generally recommend you find a good couples therapist. I think emotionally focused therapy or the Gottman method are the best. I've been doing this a long time. They seem to work the best. They seem to really get at what's going on and get those in terms of repairing and working through. But just, a lot of people these days, especially where I live in Toronto, Ontario, they have benefits from their work. The psychotherapy is covered, so it may not be anything even out of pocket for them to spend. But even if there is, and there's financially it's an issue, there's people that have sliding scale. There's even having sessions infrequently is possible. But the goal is to try to just get some kind of change happening. Unfortunately, what happens with a lot of couples is they'll have a big argument, they'll move past it, and then they have some good experiences together, so they just forget about it. They think, oh, well, we're doing really well, we've had a great week, we've had a great weekend. But without those skills, without the awareness of how to repair, then they're just kind of, just waiting for life to happen, invariably get stuck. Now, what we do find with most couples is they have these cycles that are quite common, reoccurring, and there's certain areas that trigger them frequently. So it isn't just random. There's a lot of couples almost all couples will say that they're getting in, arguments in the same areas at the same time frequently. So that is very discouraging, can feel quite hopeless. So if you feel you need professional help, by all means, find someone who's skilled in this area. Reach out to me. I take clients fairly frequently, new couples fairly frequently. And just don't let your relationship deteriorate if you don't have to. People get so much joy from their relationships, and flip side of that, they get so much pain as well. If there's a way to change that, I highly encourage you to try. Thank you for being here. Take care.